my name's Anna May, and I'm a forester and the 4th generation in the Starker family. The Starker Forest started in 1936 by my great-grandfather, T.J. Starker, and it's been in the family ever since, going to my grandfather, Bruce, and then my dad and uncle, Bart and Bond, and now me and my brother and a couple of my cousins are also involved in the business. The Starker Lecture Series started as a way to honor TJ as well as Bruce, because they're both really interested in forums for debate and new ideas in forestry. After they both passed away, the family thought it'd be a good way to carry on their legacy.
Over forest lands around Corvallis. In time, these lands became the Starker Forest, a family forestry enterprise that exemplifies the very best there is in private and family forest operations in the state and perhaps in the nation. And today, we have the honor of having the first ever Starker lecture in the Starker Lecture Hall. So this is really a special event today. Thank you to the Starker family for all the support to the college, this lecture series, and all of our students. This year, we celebrate the 37th year of the series. The Starker Lectures have challenged our thinking about a wide range of topics from local to global scales. Many have been controversial, generating intense dialogue about our businesses. And all have been stimulating and thought-provoking, exactly what a university distinguished lecture series should be. The theme of the 2022 Starker Lecture Series is Women in Forestry, Inspiring Leadership. This focuses on women who act as agents of change within forestry and forest product sector, as well as within their communities. The College of Forestry graduated its first woman student 75 years ago, Pauline Bartow-Sandoz. Today, 50% of our graduates are women. And today, the college celebrates the accomplishments of all women who are students, faculty, and alumni within our community as it strives to become a more inclusive space for all. This series will explore the triumphs of women, as well as the myriad challenges that women face in mills, forests, research labs, and beyond. This year's Starker Lecture Committee is made up of an ad hoc group of women, all women, who work in various fields of forestry and within the college, and is chaired by Julie Woodward, Acting Director of Forestry at the Oregon Forest Resource Institute, and Jessica Fitzmaurice, Event and Outreach Manager for the College of Forestry. Today, we will hear from Cristina Eisenberg, graduate faculty at the College of Forestry, who will talk about traditional ecological knowledge and forest management and conservation, a Native American perspective. In the coming weeks, we'll hear from Amanda Rao, Edie Sonahal, and to end the series, there'll be a one-day capstone workshop. Throughout the day, we will explore all aspects of forestry with a focus on women's leadership and the future of women in forestry and forest products industry. We're pleased to have over 17 women from a variety of careers joining us for panel discussions and activities throughout that day. The dates, times, and more information for this workshop are in the lobby just outside of the lecture hall. Please stop by and collect the information as you're leaving this evening. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce Gail Woodside, who is going to introduce Cristina properly. Gail is a traditional knowledge PhD candidate in the College of Agriculture and is the Indigenous liaison for the Dean's office here in the College of Forestry. And she's just a valued member of the Starker Lecture Committee as well. So with that, Gail.
Can everyone hear me? Thank you, Dean DeLuca, the Starker family, the OSU Starker Series Committee, for creating this opportunity to empower leadership of women and their important contributions in forestry. I'm so humbled and honored to be here tonight. You know, it was not long ago, well, maybe a few years ago, in the knuckle between Richardson and Peavey Hall, that Cristina, Eisenberg, and I came together in discussion. It was not the first time we had visited there. She had graduated with her PhD a couple of years earlier, and I was a couple of years into mine. It was a quiet late afternoon. As always, we shared confidences, challenges, and strengths, and many possibilities. It is those confidences between women during challenging times in strength and filled with possibilities that great change happens, and it did. Dr. Cristina Eisenberg's personal journey and lessons learned as a Native American woman in science included working with mentor Nina Leopold Bradley early on. Cristina is a Smithsonian Research Associate and former Chief Scientist at Earthwatch Institute. At the Institute, Cristina oversaw a global research program focusing on ecological restoration, social justice for Indigenous peoples, and sustainable natural resources production while utilizing traditional ecological knowledge. Today, she is working in North America, building respectful collaborations between tribal nations and the United States and Canadian federal governments to restore degraded ecosystems and empower Indigenous communities utilizing traditional ecological knowledge. Cristina is graduate faculty at Oregon State University in the College of Forestry and an outstanding alumna and alumni fellow at Oregon State. She is a Native American woman scientist of mixed Ramamori and Western Apache heritage. Currently, she is the principal investigator on two major projects within Indigenous communities: the Kainai First Nation in Waterton Lakes National Park, Alberta, Canada, and the Kainai Reserve, and the Fort Belknap Indian Community, Ani and Nakota tribes of Montana. These programs integrate traditional ecological knowledge into ecological restoration. Her 5-year program with Fort Belknap is funded by the Bureau of Land Management in partnership with the Society of Ecological Restoration. And Dr. Eisenberg has authored several books, journal articles, chapters, and serves on several boards. She is in Northwest Montana, where she lives with her husband in a wild, remote valley. You know, it's important to understand the possibilities create great change. As women in science, we need to support each other with our possibilities. It is no secret that women, all of us, are standing in the center of all creation. We were placed there by the Creator due to our abilities to bring forward life and create change in the world. We must all ensure that we support our strengths and challenges with possibilities as women hold up half of the sky. And now it is my great honor to introduce you to Morning Star Woman, Mistaki Kakatsutsaki, Dr. Cristina Eisenberg.
Thank you, Gail, and thank you to the Starker family, to the Starker Lecture Committee, to Dean DeLuca, to the College of Forestry community for inviting me to give this lecture. As an alumna, and as a student, I was profoundly influenced by the Starker Lecture Series. And so it is quite humbling to be giving this talk today. I'm going to be sharing my journey as a woman in forestry and the insights that I've learned. I did my PhD defense in forest ecosystems and society almost exactly 10 years ago. And the journey that I've had since then, and the many lessons that I've learned, and all the possibilities that those lessons have opened up for me and for other women in forestry. So, women in forestry, what's it like? Well, it's a trail through the woods. The image on the left is a trail camera picture from my PhD research. And that is an elk trail, and that's one of the wolves that I studied. And there's a wolf den probably about 100 meters away from where that wolf is. And it's just this beautiful day, and the wolf is cruising through the woods. Other times, it's like the image on the right. So that's me leading my field crew. That's stand one. I want you to remember that stand because we will come back to it. And we're doing, we put 120 kilometers of these transects in that spring. And they're to assess wildlife use. So, you know, you do field work and you do things like this, and it's really no big deal. That's part of doing field work. But you see the mountain in the back? Well, first of all, my 13-year-old daughter took that picture. She was with me in the field. The mountain in the back, this was May in 2007. And back then it was a lot colder than it is now. So a typical mid-May morning would mean it would have gone down to maybe 15 degrees in the night, and it might go up to 50 or even 60 degrees during the day. And the day before this image was taken was the very first day of field work. And I'm sitting on the ground with my field crew going over the methods, and we just, you know, I didn't want to do anything wrong being a typical PhD student about to launch data collection. I wanted to make sure everything, all the methods we carefully worked out in the lab, that I was applying them correctly. And so it's this beautiful, clear day, very crisp and cold. And I hear, as I'm looking down at the methods with my field crew, I hear this rumble. And I said, oh, there's thunder, you know, but it was a clear day. And so I said, wait a minute. And I look up, and that mountain is coming down towards us. There was this massive rock slide. So these are limestone mountains. And when it gets, you know, cold and warm and cold and warm, the snow melts, the snow water collects in those cracks, and you get lots of rock slides. And we literally had to run for our lives where we had been sitting. There were rocks the size of my work vehicle the next day. All of us were runners, so we just ran for it, right? But that was like, okay, Cristina, if you want to do this work, pay attention. So that's how I started my work as a woman in forestry. Robin Wald-Kimmerer, who is a colleague and mentor, dear mentor of mine, really this presentation is dedicated in part to the lessons that she's taught me. And she gave a beautiful lecture last month as part of this series. So this is her definition of TEK. It's one of the earlier definitions, and it is entirely owned by a Native American. A lot of the very first definitions were by white scholars who were attempting to really bring to light the importance of Indigenous knowledge. So you see there's certain words in here that have to do with values. So sensitivity to change is something that in Western science we look at, but reciprocity, this generational transfer of knowledge and caring. So here is a synthesis of what I've learned over the years. And then I'm going to give you some examples from some of the projects that I've led. So foundational TEK and ecology principles. The education I got here was this amazing, very rigorous Western science education. And in my work, I've brought that together with traditional ecological knowledge. And these are my thoughts. This image is, and by the way, all the images here, either I took them or they were taken by a few of them were taken by others, but they were all used with permission if they have Indigenous people in them. So I want to be very clear about that. That is me and my field crew, the first day of the field season, about 2016. And we started with a ceremony. We're working on tribal land, on Blackfoot tribal land. That's Chief Mountain in the background. I'm in the bottom center. Sitting next to me is the chief ecologist for the national park that is adjacent to that tribal land. And that is that fusion of Western science and traditional ecological knowledge. And the elders said, if you're going to work on our land, you have to start with ceremony. And park manager said, of course. And so this was the first time that this had happened. Until then, park managers and the tribes in the area had trouble collaborating and seeing eye to eye on things. And so this was like an opening. So everything is connected. I've learned this from data, and I've learned this from the elders and from the youngest of the young people that have joined me in the field, to honor the earth, that change is intrinsic to all of nature, to respect the earth and life in all of its diversity, to care for the community of life with understanding, compassion, and love, to create societies that are just, participatory, sustainable, and peaceful, to secure Earth's bounty and beauty for present and future generations. Deb Halland, who is another one of my mentors, in a meeting that I was invited to participate in that she led about 3 weeks ago, she said, we don't want to continue to harm Mother Earth. We are protecting her so she is not damaged any more than she already is. We're striving to get it right and find the best path forward. The federal colonialist system doesn't work. This is how she opened a meeting that had tribal leaders from about 30 tribes, myself, her, 5 secretaries, members of the president's cabinet, and 3 deputy secretaries. That's what she started out with. And it was a meeting about how can we collaborate with tribes and how can we honor tribal sovereignty. This recently happened. It happened in November that the White House is leading this major effort to honor TEK and is mandating that it be ITEK, Indigenous Traditional Ecological Knowledge, be included in everything that the United States does, with not just natural resources, but every single secretary that's a member of the cabinet has to acknowledge this, and it should be used to inform decision-making. So the things that I'm going to share with you, when I had many of these lessons, was way before anything that we could even imagine anything like this happening. But now we have this body of knowledge and experience that's emerging about TEK, and now we have federal, very strong, not just acknowledgement of it, but a mandate that we have to do this. And the reason is that Western science alone isn't going to solve the problems that we're facing right now with climate change and other environmental stressors, massive wildfires. And so TEK, by combining it with Western science, can give us some of our best opportunities to find a solution. Also, the international principles and standards for the practice of ecological restoration, these are standards used by the United Nations and other leading global organizations. I was a co-author on these standards, and Principle 2 said in order to succeed, ecological restoration must draw on all types of knowledge, including local knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge. So settler colonialism, I'm going to give you some context for where we are today. So it's defined as the policy of foreign polity seeking to extend or retain its authority over people or territories. And it's about exploitation for economic gain for the colonizers. And this is an image from the mouth of the Columbia River in 1793. So Oregon, like every place on the planet, practically is marked with the ravages of settler colonialism. And land grant universities are part of that legacy. So they were established in 1862 through the Morrill Act, and there's 58 of them in the US. They involved expropriating Indigenous lands to form their foundations. Often genocide was involved. It was certainly forced removal. And OSU received 92,000 acres of such land. So what are we going to do about this today? And we'll go back to this, and you will have probably get some ideas about this during the course of my talk. So settler colonialism is part of the Anthropocene and really enabled the Anthropocene. And it is, started in the 17th century, but it's basically man over nature. It meant that, this perspective that humans can control everything would be the best way for humans to sustain themselves. It is based on capitalism. Some of the effects were to kill all the predators, eliminate fire, cut down as many trees as possible, strip mining for coal, and draining wetlands. And in the work that I did at Earthwatch, I got to observe this all over the world. So whether you're talking about Mongolia or Iowa, you see the same types of effects of settler colonialism. So the degradation came to the attention of people like Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot, who founded the Forest Service in 1905. And they were very concerned about fixing this. So Pinchot created this model that's an alternative to just unbridled removal of resources. And it was based on sustained yield of timber. It was a profit-based system, and fire exclusionist policy was part of this. And in his autobiography and memoir, he wrote, "There are just two things on this material earth, people and natural resources." So compare that to the traditional ecological knowledge perspective that humans are part of nature and nature is our teacher. Very different perspective. Now, Aldo Leopold was Pinchot's student, and he was one of the first graduates of the Yale School of Forestry. And there he is on his horse, and he quickly got hired in District 3 of the Forest Service, and he's getting ready to cruise timber. For my master's studies, I did a lot of archival work on Aldo Leopold, and I was blown away by what I found. And this was before his papers were digitized, so I was able to look at all of his field notebooks, for example, including his field notebooks from when he was in early part of his career when he was cruising timber. And what he noted in his field notebooks was that he found massive degradation. He found that timber harvest combined with fire suppression and intensive livestock grazing was leading to, was creating ecosystems that weren't resilient, soil erosion, really negatively impacting wildlife populations, and non-native species eruptions, and limited forest regeneration and plant community shifts. And he also noted that climate change could be responsible for some of this. So he observed climate change. He recommended that to create more resilient ecosystems, one should look at the practices of Native American people who once managed all the lands in North America. And he wrote this article, Paiute Forestry. And he reflected on forest resiliency. But what does it take to create a resilient forest? Now, this was 1920. This was more than 100 years ago. And in some ways, it feels like we haven't made a lot of progress. In other ways, I think we have, but this is what a visionary he was. And Leopold was directly related to the Starkers. And so there's a very strong connection there in terms of the philosophy of working forests and working lands. This is Sierra Ancha. I did a residency there as a master's student, and it's one of the areas where Leopold cruised timber and did surveys. And so I wanted to look at some of those lands, and they really hadn't changed much since he did those surveys because the same practices were still being used. And this was like 2003. So I want to thank Michael Nelson. I wanted to talk about the land ethic. And I said, Michael, how do you define an ethic? And how do you define it in the context of natural resources and their management? And he said it's a belief. There's many definitions of an ethic, but he said it's for our purposes, he would define it as a belief about what is good and right and wrong and why, and a belief about what we ought to do, and that management, effective management, links science and ethics. So his land ethics statement, Aldo Leopold, is the thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. It took him 17 years to create that statement, and I saw all his notes about it, and portions of it were published in various journal articles. So then he died of a heart attack while fighting a prescribed fire that had gotten out of control on his neighbor's land. And I always was left wondering, how would he have rewritten that or revised that 20 years later in his life? He was 50 years old when he died. So, and the question I have for you, and I'd like you to keep this in your minds, is what could a contemporary land ethics statement that includes TEK and social justice look like? I was mentored by his daughter, his oldest daughter, Nina Leopold Bradley. Image on the left is she and I talking about forest ecology and going for a walk in the woods at the shack, the Leopold shack. He bought this land in 1935. It was utterly degraded farmland. It was a failed wheat farm north of Madison, Wisconsin. They planted several thousand trees. I found all of the ledgers in which they recorded all the trees they planted. They eradicated non-native plant species as much as possible. They replaced them with native grasses, and they reinstated prescribed burning. There's Nina planting seedlings. She was a pretty badass person. For a woman in forestry, she was pretty fearless. And she's about 19 years old there. But the thing that happened is that in the process of restoring this land, and that's a picture of the shack when they first moved there, it was their weekend where they spent the weekends working on restoration, is that They learned to care for the land as much as they cared for each other, and that to love a place means accepting moral responsibility for its well-being. So Robin Wall Kimmer puts this in her lecture, and this is a quote from her: to see land as a teacher, a healer, land as a responsibility, and land as sacred. So this is what happened at the shack. Leopold died in 1950, and all of the restored forest was left alone. Nobody touched anything. Nina was off in Africa. She got married, and she lived in Africa for quite a long while and raised her kids there. Her husband was a wildlife biologist, and she was his lead technician. So she was raising her kids and doing field work in Africa. When that marriage failed, she came back and she took over management of the Leopold Reserve and specifically management of the forests. The image on the top was taken in 2004. Nothing had been done yet. And she talked to me about all the things they had talked about doing. Image on the bottom was taken in 2009. And these are the left side. That is what they did. So they did a variable retention harvest on that land, and then they burned it. Middle image is one of the harvested sites a few years later, and then it was burned, and you can see all the stuff coming up. There's a lot of poplars in there, but there's a variety, there's quite a few species of trees. The image on the top right is a prescribed burn. They were doing their burns before bud burst in early, right after the snow melt. An image on the bottom, and that's at the shack, but on the bottom what you see is poplars that were also burned on her land, which is right across the street from the shack, and how they're growing. And then what we talked about was there are no wolves present. And this particular stand, they were very far from her house. So the factors that you would think of that might influence, that kind of recruitment. And so what she said to me is, Cristina, I think these relationships are complicated. And wolves matter, but there's a lot of other factors, and so we had some fascinating conversations about this. This is the postdoc work I did with Dave Hibbs, who was my PhD advisor, and then became my co-PI in the research I was doing on the effects of fire in Waterton Lakes National Park, Alberta. And there were a series of prescribed fires that the park staff, their ecology staff, set in the area that I studied for my PhD. And these were large. I mean, they were, 1,000 to 2,000 hectares in size. And there were reburns. And we were looking at the effects of prescribed fire on forest structure in an area that had a very active wolf population and one of the highest densities of elk measured in North America. So everything was going great. We were finding some cool things. And then all of a sudden, the Kena wildfire, it was a lightning strike in BC, burned our study site. It was 40,000 hectares, and it burned it with extreme severity. And all along, we've incorporated the Kainai First Nation, their Blackfoot, in this work. And I obtained funding from Earthwatch. This was before I worked at Earthwatch. I was funded by Earthwatch to involve the community to look at the traditional ecological knowledge components of fire, because fire was very much traditionally used by the Kainai First Nation. And so over the years, we had 109 Kainai First Nation community fellows. Many of them ended up being hired by federal and tribal agencies. These were all highly at-risk youth. We provided jobs for many of them on our project, and several of them have finished their bachelor's degrees, and some are even working on master's degrees. So they're leaders in conservation. And there were 150 Earthwatch volunteers over the years. So this is what the Kena wildfire did. We were evacuated. I was in the field with my crew and we were evacuated twice from that. It was a 2-kilometer long and 600 meter tall wall of flame that was moving at the rate of about 40 kilometers per hour downslope, which isn't supposed to happen. The image in the center is one of our aspen stands. And it's still there, but you could see how much of it burned down to the roots. And then the image on the top right, that's what that same spot looked like 2 months later. And those are mostly all native species that came up. Many of them are soil stabilizers. There I am with Dave Hebbs and Scott Murphy, the fire ecologists for the park. We had some great times afield just puzzling over all of this. And those were some very special times for me as a new ecologist, trying to figure out how all these pieces fit together. The image on the bottom right is of one of the aspen stands that burned with extreme severity, meaning over 90% of the canopy trees are dead. The next year, 2019, we observed 600,000 sprouts per hectare, which is, I have never seen those kinds of numbers. So that's what this fire did, that everybody thought was a catastrophe. And also, of the fires in North America, it was the most uniformly high severity or higher fire. So it just really, burned everything with very high severity. And that is not, usually you get a mosaic effect. Even the big fires in Oregon have been mosaics of fire severity. So this is stand one. Remember stand one? Okay, stand one, I shared with you the lesson that stand one taught me, when I started collecting field data. Well, now this is like about 8 years later. No, this is like a decade later. Stand one, so you see the rebar marker in the top picture. I did songbird point counts and I was only allowed to have 30 centimeters of those rebars exposed because this is a national park and they didn't want the public intrusion on the public's enjoyment of a pristine site, right? So I was very diligent about that. And so because of that, I know how much soil was removed. Some of this soil burned and some of it was blown away after this fire. There were sustained 100-kilometer-per-hour winds for about 2 months. What it revealed, though, was the Kainai elders had been telling us all of these stories based on traditional ecological knowledge. And they were stories about how this land was used by their ancestors. They were stories that the non-Indigenous anthropologists and archaeologists and paleontologists affiliated with some of the universities in Canada said were completely false. It couldn't have happened that way. Here's what our science shows. Well, when the Kena wildfire removed that much soil, what we found was every single thing that those elders had been telling us was the case, was exactly right. Bottom right image, that was a skull found by a 9-year-old Kainai young girl. It's a skull of bison antiquus, a species that went extinct 10,000 years ago. And we were told that bison were never really in this area. It's too close to the mountains. Those are piles of bison bone in the image on the left. And we found lots of stone tools. But this is stand one. We found several more of those skulls. And also near that skull was the jawbone of the dire wolf. And that went extinct about 10,000 years ago too. So this is TEK. And it got me thinking, people would say, well, it's so subjective and it's so, biased. How can you believe, take it seriously? And this really shifted my perspective. And it's a combination of the Western science I had been doing. It also showed me that the relationships I was studying, how wolves interacted with their prey and the effects of fire on those relationships, were ancient in that landscape. So these are some of my teachers. Most of them are elders. These are members of the Kainai First Nation. I need to honor them because without them, Dave and I would not have known what to do. I mean, we had all the Western science, but it took their wisdom to really get us on the right path. And the Kainai First Nation has the Kainai Ecosystem Protection Association, and many of these individuals founded that association, were founders of it. William Singer is an elder who is an ethnobotanist, and he and I have been collaborating quite a bit lately and exploring ideas. But anyway, and Kanzi Fox is a graduate student now. She leads the Flood Tribe, as they're also called, land department and their ecology program. So then I began working in Scotland. My co-PI was the lead ecologist in Waterton Lakes National Park, Barb Johnston. That was great fun. We were asked to come in and assess a restoration program, one of the largest restoration programs in the Scottish Highlands, where they had replanted a lot of woodlands. Now, what happened in Scotland was it was once a mosaic of Caledonian forests. It was the homeland of the Picts, which were an indigenous people. They were fierce warriors. Their descendants are still there. This land provided habitat for large herbivores, moose, auroch, which is like a type of a combination of cattle and bison species, and deer. And they refer to elk as deer in Scotland. So there were what we consider deer here, there, as well as elk. And predators, a full suite of predators. And ecosystem engineers, such as beavers. So 6,000 years ago, these forests, it's thought, reached their climax point. And then they started declining because of a shift in the climate. 2,200 years ago, the Romans arrived in Scotland. They had run out of resources in their homeland, so they were colonizing other areas. And 800 years ago, the Nords arrived in Scotland. And together, even with Hadrian's Wall, the Romans were able to get into the area where we were working. It's at almost 60 degrees latitude, so pretty far north. And that's a relict pine, Pinus sylvestris. So there were the ones that remained were the ones where the wood was too twisted to be able to provide good wood for, mainly they used them for building ships. So it was not, usable wood, so they left them. Anyway, they cut down the remaining forests, they extirpated predators, moose and auroch, and they introduced non-native sheep, which some of the locals refer to as woolly maggots because of the damage that they do. Deer erupted, that means they exploded in number, and all of this caused profound ecosystem shifts, big changes in the soil, which then affected, there became this feedback loop that limited how other species could grow and develop. The Allendale Wilderness Preserve was created in the early 2000s. It's 9,200 hectares of woodlands and peatlands. Scots pine is a dominant species in the woodland, but there's about 7 native species present. It includes blanket bog and peatland and mixed woodland and montane vegetation. Image on the bottom right is where we were based out of, and it contains 2 glacial valleys as reserve, and that area is a free-for-all for the deer, as they call them. It's Cervus elephas. They're just about 2/3 the size of the ones that we have here, and that has to be the habitat, we believe. So they eat everything down to nothing. And image in the center is a close-up of some of the damage done by deer to pines. On the left, what you see is a panoramic shot that I took of the peatlands, and you can see that the peat is eroding. Those are called peat hags, and it is eroding. It's thought to be driven, it can be driven by a number of things, but a big driver is climate change. And if you look to the north there, that's facing north. You can see all just outside the reserve, all the managed forests, and they're planted with Douglas fir, and there is some lodgepole in there. Anyway, I met with those woodland owners, and I gave them a copy of Norm, Debbie, and Jerry's book, Ecological Forest Management. I gave them all copies of your book, and we had some fascinating conversations about forest management. So the work that Barb and I were doing was, we were working very collaboratively with landowners adjacent to the reserve. This is what it looked like. They planted 1 million trees opportunistically without a plan. So they would just say, oh, we have 100,000 trees here, let's just plant them, you know. And so we were asked to come in and assess how well this had worked and whether they were ready to go to the next phase of restoration. They fenced them all off. And we were pretty skeptical about what we would find. This is what the sites, the restored sites look like, and us in the field measuring the survival and also the structure, so how high and how much growth they were putting on. You can see the relict pines on the top of that slope, and in the bottom you can see the restored trees. And this is one of the oldest restoration sites that they had there, probably dating back to 2003. And the objective was they wanted to reintroduce wolves. And so they brought in Doug Smith of Yellowstone, who leads the wolf project there and who is a colleague of mine, to advise us. And our question was, have these forests grown tall enough that we're able to take down the fences, turn the deer loose, and bring in wolves? And this is a very famous site, so there's a lot of attention on this. And what we found was that the trees there were growing at the rate, the pines at about 4 centimeters a year. And that it would have taken another 15 years before you can remove those fences and been assured of enough recruitment of both, of canopy recruitment to enable, deer to be free and wolves, reintroduction of a predator like a wolf. In Fort Belknap, I started that project in 2018, and now Tom DeLuca has recently joined me as a co-PI. And what we're doing there, this is out on the prairie, but there's mountains that are part of our study site. It's quite a large study site. It's funded by BLM. It's all the BLM lands that surround the reservation. Our study site goes up to the Canadian border and south to the wildlife reserve there. It's a C.M. Russell Wildlife Reserve. And then east and west about on to the east about another 50 miles. So it's huge. And the Little Rockies are in the middle of that. What we do there is we work really closely with the Fort Belknap Indian community. We work on their land and on BLM land. And there is a tribal historical preservation officer working with us to show us what archaeological sites look like. That's a stone circle. That area has the highest density of archaeological sites of any place in the United States. Our study site does. And so we have to be very careful not to disturb anything and not to disrespect those sites. So this project is a synthesis of TEK and BLM best science, including seeds of success and assessment, inventory, and monitoring protocols, and SER standards. Our objective is to help the BLM develop resources to restore degraded lands. And the use of TEK and SER guidelines, it's an incredibly progressive project, and BLM approached me and asked me to do this work modeled after the work that Dave and I had been doing in Alberta. And it's pretty astonishing to have a federal agency say to you, can you teach us how to apply TEK? And also they wanted to use the funding to provide jobs and income for the community. So there's a lot of cool images here. One thing I want to highlight is that the woman in the orange shirt that's kneeling, she's the botanist for the Montana Dakotas region. She's meeting with an elder. This is before we started collecting data. We just had a traditional ceremony to ask her advice about which plants we should be focusing on. And then we have done every single thing the elders have advised. So it's also priority sage grouse habitat. So this is really an important landscape to the BLM. The outcomes have been, 15,000 hours of employment for mostly tribal members, 95% Native Americans, and we've collected 25 pounds of seed. Now, what's even more astonishing, and this is what we observed last summer, and this is, Tom and I corresponded about this while I was in the field because it was so surprising. And he was not yet working as a co-PI on this project. And so it quickly became obvious that we had to look far deeper to find an explanation for this. So it was a category 4 drought in our study site last summer. Image on the left is BLM land, and image on the right is Fort Belknap Indian community land. Same plant communities. So the BLM land is not planted with non-natives. It hasn't been plowed, but basically the drought was so severe that nothing, in most spots look like this with BLM land, and we surveyed pretty hard. And so basically nothing grew above 6 inches and nothing bloomed, none of the native grasses. The image on the bottom is also BLM land. It's one of the few places where we found that the plants did bloom. But then when they got to making seeds, the seed pods were hollow, so they had not formed the cotyledon. They had aborted the growth of the cotyledon just to stay alive, to direct their energy to their roots and tissues to keep themselves alive. On Fort Belknap land, the grasses were this tall. I'm not that tall, but even so. And Tessa Jasonis, who's in the audience, she was a technician on our project, and she observed those the amazing difference between the two lands. Tessa put in trail cameras on tribal land and was able to document quite a lot of cattle grazing. So you can't say this is because of cattle grazing. So that left what could be happening in the soil. And the TEK aspect is that maybe when this was made a reservation, the tribe continued burning, and but fire was excluded from BLM land. So maybe, and this is something Tom has studied for years, is the beneficial effects of fire, prescribed and wildfire in soils. And so we're going to be looking at those legacies this coming summer. And Tessa is going to be the lead technician. And she's starting as a PhD student in the College of Forestry. So sweetgrass, this is one of the mountain sites in our study area on Fort Belknap. And Robin Waldkimmer uses it as a metaphor for weaving together Western science and traditional ecological knowledge. It's a sacred plant. So this particular patch The year before we had surveyed it, so in 2020, and it was about 50 meters by 100 meters, the patch. And it's in the Little Rocky Mountains, so you could see there's Doug firs there, and there's some ponderosas and some mixed forest. Last year it was about a kilometer by a couple hundred meters in size, the same patch. And in 2020 we picked some, and which is what you're supposed to do. And I was not sure about that. Like, how could we pick this? It's such a small patch. But we made one little braid of it. That braid is hanging in. It was made by the Fort Belknap young women and Monroe Fox, who is a lead technician who is from the Kainai First Nations. And I have that braid in my truck, my work truck, as a reminder of these relationships. So this year we were able to collect quite a lot of seed for propagation from that sweetgrass. And in a drought, it expanded like that, which I can't explain it with my Western science, you know, and I think we have to look a lot deeper, and there will be plots put in there and soil work done in there too. So ethnobotany is a great way to bridge the gap between Western science and TEK. Roz Lapierre of the University of Montana Environmental Studies program, she's a professor. She also has the Ethnobotany garden. She mentored us in ethnobotany last summer. She joined us in the field. And it is really the study of how culture and traditional use of native plants using TEK, how that can inform Western science. And there's an excellent book by Nancy Turner on the ethnobotany of the Pacific Northwest. I highly recommend it. It's a 2-volume set. So forestry, traditional ecological knowledge, and two-eyed seeing. You know, this is also, you know, what I've come to on this journey, through my nonlinear journey through as a woman in forestry, is that to help healthy forests, we must bring together multiple ways of knowing. And I think the examples that I've shown you, you know, demonstrate that. So everyone must have a voice for this to work, though, and not be tokenized or exploited. So it's not enough to say we're consulting elders, you know, if you haven't really gone the distance and actually done that and done it right. The image on the left is another year when it was the beginning of our field season, and there had just been a sweat lodge ceremony to mark the beginning of our field season. This is in Alberta. Women are not allowed in sweat lodges there, so only the men go in. So the guy in the green t-shirt, he's the chief of natural resources for Waterton Lakes National Park. He went into the sweat. With the elder on the right is Mike Brucehead, and he's one of my mentors, and he's a PhD student about to defend his dissertation on TEK in May. And, you know, I'm there with Kenzie Fox, the tribal ecologist, and in our traditional attire. And we're collaborating. We were actually having a conversation there at the time when this picture was taken about co-management and ecological restoration. And this had never happened there before. That level of trust between federal agencies and Indigenous people, First Nations, had not happened in that part of Canada before. So this was quite a groundbreaking moment. And it felt like that ceremony created that space for that to happen. But in order for that to be possible, we need to address what you see in every institution, such as the College of Forestry, every major university, every federal agency, and even in conservation nonprofits. So, you know, this has to do with critical race theory. That it's like the way we we manage nations has based on principles of settler colonialism. So that creates implicit bias. That creates intersectionality. So that means if you're a woman in forestry, you have, that can make your path harder. But if you're a woman of color in forestry, that makes it even harder, right? And let's say you're a woman of color in forestry and you're two-spirited. It gets even more complicated. So that's intersectionality. And then the structural racism that's embedded in the systems that we have for managing natural resources. If we address that, what we get is inclusive excellence. And I believe that what is happening in places like with the Kainai First Nations and federal agencies in Alberta is what we're getting. And I also see that with the work that we're doing in Fort Belknap. And Robin mentioned two-eyed seeing, and this is a model for two-eyed seeing and natural resources co-management. So you begin with mutual research interest and you move through this cycle that at every stage involves bringing people together, culture to culture. And then maybe you can figure out what it takes to create healthy forests. This is our land. And this forest land lies in the Swan Valley. It's not our land. We just happen to live there. We're, caretakers of it for future generations. It lies in the Swan Valley, Montana, within the traditional homelands of the Nchaha, the Kootenai people. This tribe was forcibly removed to a reservation in Montana. Today, living descendants of these people are part of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. Image on the left is before. So they used to burn this valley regularly, and it's a very interesting forest. It has, cedars in there, and it has ponderosas and larches and Douglas firs. I haven't quite figured it out. I think it has to do with the elevation. It's kind of on the shoulder of the mountain. But when they were removed, there was timber harvest that happened and then nothing. And this is what we got on our land. And that's the thinning that we did, which I mentored a young man who did all the thinning for us. And it took about a year. And almost within a month of when he did that thinning, lynx showed up. They like a complex forest structure that has early seral components, openings, and then older trees. And now when I sit on Zoom calls, my window faces out towards this woods, the window in my loft where my office is. I see wolves chasing deer through these trees, and what's happening in the understory is beautiful. Everything is just this riot of life. So some people have a hard time with this type of thinning, and what we did was we tried to replicate the effects of the fire and the historic forest structure, and there are historical photographs that show what that structure is. So how can TEK help conserve the forests of the future? These are also my insights, and I've been sharing with you some of my insights. They're just my personal insights. I believe, however, that this set of guidelines is something that must be observed wherever you are if you're working with Indigenous people. And if you just take 2 or 3 of these and call it good, it's not going to work. So everyone must be equal. You must work government to government. That means memorandums of understanding, legal documents that spell out how you will honor sovereignty rights. You must engage tribal elders. You must build strong institutional allyships. You must honor treaty rights and data sovereignty at every step, and that means every single person involved. So all it takes is one of your field crew members to not do that, to sample in a sacred site where they're not supposed to collect something they're not supposed to, or to share data with people that's sensitive, and it's all over, and you will not be trusted again. You must work closely with the Tribal Historical Preservation Officer and the Tribal Council. You must create economic advancement community opportunities for the community. That's reciprocity. When you're working with people who have had everything taken from them, you have to bring them gifts. And the gift is not your knowledge. In fact, you don't know anything. When you go into a community, they know way more about what's going on ecologically than you do. The gift is elevating them. And you must follow through on what's promised. Bring people together, not just at the beginning or at the end, or maybe once a year, but through every single thing that you do. Incorporate traditional ceremonies if you're working with Indigenous people. Create a space for them to do that. In our BLM budget, there's line items for ceremonial supplies, like sweetgrass and sage and blankets to give to the elders, because it's a culture based on a gifting culture. BLM said, sure, what do you need? We want to do this right, which is astonishing. Create STEM opportunities for tribal youth, because every tribal nation I've worked with all over the world is hungry for Western science. They really want to learn it and use it as a tool, as long as it is, in keeping with their traditions as well. So that means forestry, botany, restoration ecology, soil science, and wildlife disciplines are highly desired by tribal members. And generate jointly written peer-reviewed publications. And we did that with the Wildfire. There are elders that are co-authors, and there's federal managers, and there's amazing fire ecologists on that paper. It takes a village. This image is one of Gail Woodside's collared elk on her PhD project, and she will be defending her dissertation sometime soon. She's very close. And she's an example, and there's many other people here, like Val Goodness, who did her master's here and then went on to do a PhD, Samantha Chisholm Hatfield, Laura Jacobs, who are passionately bringing in the TEK with the Western science and helping teach all of us what those standards are, what we must do. So I hear talk about how here people want to partner with tribal nations in Oregon to on forest co-management, looking at some of the federal forests and the state forests. Well, many of those forests are on treaty land, land that were their traditional hunting and gathering lands. And so this laundry list of elements, is something that really needs to be kept in the foreground as one enters into those partnerships. So forests of the future. There's a wonderful paper by Hagman et al. I highly recommend it, about how forests have changed as a result of things like fire suppression. This is an Oregon forest burning up recently. A lot of even-aged trees, closed canopy. So to manage a forest, I got this from Jerry Franklin. So forests of the future need to be managed for a broader array of ecological functions. We need resilience to wildfire and other disturbances, so management that fosters that. Climate change mitigation, and it requires partnership and collaboration across culture, too I've seen. So the question again is, what could a contemporary land ethic statement that includes TEK and social justice look like? And how could that be applied to forests, such as the forest in Oregon? And women as change makers, well, this is Monroe Fox, one of the technicians on projects I've led over the years. She started working for me when she was 13. She's now 18. You can see the look of joy on her face. That also was stand one. Okay, and she had just discovered a new species of grass that the chief botanist for Parks Canada was with us, and he had not ever found that species. This was after the keynote. And that day she said to me, Cristina, I discovered what I want to do with my life. And I said, well, you're going to have to be really strong, and you're going to need good allies and good mentors. So show up as your most authentic self. Don't be somebody who you aren't just to navigate through the system. Practice 7 generations thinking, or what one of the Kainai high school kids said to Sarah Hibbs when she said, what do you think is the most important thing? And she said, to be a good ancestor. This was a 15-year-old girl. So we should all be good ancestors. Be solution focused rather than problem focused. So Michael Nelson and Tom DeLuca authored a journal article recently where they said, think of how differently things would go if one said yes and rather than no but. So focus on those solutions. Be willing to meet people where they are with an open mind and bring your best to each moment. So this image is of a restored large forest just down the valley from where we live and what is Forest Service land. They did a thinning, a prescribed burn. They tried to get it back into the type of stand structure that would have existed 100 years ago when the Kootenai and the Pondre were going through this valley to gather traditional plants and hunt and burning regularly. And I watched that understory in a sense of awe. I took this in October of last year. So there's nothing but native grass and native forests in that understory. And it is so beautiful and so full of life. So, we have a ways to go, but I believe that we are getting there. All of the people on the left, starting with Dave Hibbs, Paul Gosher, Norm Johnson, Jerry Franklin, Gail Woodside, Valerie Goodness, Brenda McComb, Trent Sager, Lisa Gagno, Hal Salwasser, Fred Swanson, Chris Dunn, Tom DeLuca, Matt Betts, Randy Rosenberger, Bill Ripple, Dan Edge, Michael Nelson, Kathleen Dean Moore, and Charles Goodrich have mentored me and influenced my thinking on this topic of TEK and traditional and Western science and where we need to go. I'm deeply grateful for all that they have taught me. I wouldn't be here today without them. So with that, I'll open it up for questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming, everyone out in Zoom land as well, as we can see. We'll have about 15 minutes for questions. Some of the questions are going to be coming from the audience in the Zoom location and also here. So if you have any questions, why don't we start with somebody in our audience here, and then we'll try to gather questions back and forth so that we can give an equal chance to everyone involved. Yes, Norm.
Cristina, thank you for sharing that remarkable journey you've been on. Wow. How have you thought about how you integrate traditional ecological knowledge in forestry education? Then you're in the College of Forestry.
Yeah, I have been thinking about that. And one of the last slides where I showed. Okay, yeah, I have been thinking about that. And one of my last slides where I listed all of the attributes of successful collaboration, that needs to be taught at the graduate level, because I'm bombarded with questions about this constantly, like in my inbox, my emails. Nobody really knows how to do this, and people are looking for like shortcuts to that. So one idea would be to have a graduate course. There are wonderful courses, one of them taught by Gail about TEK that are at the undergraduate level, but we need graduate programming in that. The other would be like community ecology courses that would be field-based, that would like what we did today in the Starker Forest and the BLM land, where students would go into the field and part of the class could be a field course where they would learn to look for the signatures of TEK, the long history of land management. And then in the classroom, there's so much great literature on this, such as Frank Lake's work, Robin Wall-Kimmer's work. There's a lot of emerging literature on this. So, and that at the undergraduate level would be the place to make those connections. I have had, like I mentioned, a 9-year-old girl found those skulls, right? And the jaw of the dire wolf. So I believe that actually this should start a lot earlier, and it could be part of an extension program as well to bring this into the community and to start these conversations going. Thanks, Mark.
Jessica, are there any questions?
How can I actively engage with Indigenous communities in ways that are earnest and respectful?
Yeah, well, first you should wait to be invited, and rather than just coming in, or engage an ally, somebody who already has built relationships with that community and have them introduce you. Your initial conversations should always be with the tribal council and the tribal historic preservation officer, the TIPO as they're called, and they can also be called cultural preservation officers. They're the gatekeeper. And if you convince them that, well, Indigenous people tend to size up others very rapidly. And my experience has been is that either they don't trust someone or they open their whole heart to that person, and there's no in between. It's a very different way of having business relationships. So, and just show up as your authentic self, be prepared and well-versed in like the list that I showed you, those basic principles of collaboration. And it happens so rarely that sovereignty rights are truly honored and respected, and that people approach Indigenous people as equals rather than in a patronizing way, like I'm a Western scientist, I'm a postdoc, and I want to help you, restore this land. Is a very common, approach, and nothing against postdocs. I did a couple of those, and you're bumbling your way through it, but just to realize if you've had a good enough education, what you learn is that you know very little, and to be open to the, really open to the ideas that they have.
Okay, someone here?
And maybe building on that comment, could you address sort of the element of time?
how long does it take? Like you feel like you couldn't just jump right in. You'd had these years of building these relationships. Is that what's needed?
Yeah, and I almost put that on that slide. It takes a lot of time. So you like, let's say somebody has this funding opportunity and the grant deadline is in 3 months. And they have this idea that they want to work with a particular tribe. Well, that's not going to do it. And also we're in the middle of a pandemic still. You know, hopefully we're heading out of it. But the pandemic has slowed down all of these processes even more. And so to build the trust with the Kainai First Nation, they invited me to work with them. And it was Narcissus Blood who did that. But it took about 1.5 years from the time he invited me until Dave and I got a research permit. And the story behind that is that the tribal council was talking, debating whether they could trust me. And I'm Indigenous and I was invited and they're still debating this, right? And that's just the way things are. And so there was a child in the audience who they knew had had some contact with me, was a tribal member. And one of the members of the tribal council turned to her and said, "So what do you think of this lady? Can we trust her?" And she said, "She's like our mother." And so then they voted unanimously to approve our permit, right? So it's a very different worldview and it's a non-linear process. So that's a great question, Janine. You're doing it on Indian time, and that gets into meet people on their own terms, to be willing to do that. But the good news is that once you build a relationship like that, what happened is Fort Belknap saw what we were doing and they reached out to me and said, "Can you do this on our land?" And so then that process took only 1 year, right? And so, I think that as there's more momentum around this, and particularly with some of the work that President Biden, the White House Council on Tribal Relations and Secretary Highlands are doing, that this is going to go a lot more rapidly moving forward.
Sorry, I just had it and then I lost it.
Let's go, Zoe.
Thank you so much for sharing with us your time and your story today. I just like so many notes from both. I'm taking away to think about today. With sharing your story today and these beautiful research experiences and opportunities around the world that you had, I guess I would love if you have any wisdom to share for young ecologists, young Indigenous ecologists, and people, these undergraduate and graduate students in the College of Forestry who are entering the field and are interested in traditional ecological knowledge and Western science intersection, about, especially the students with mixed heritage, like how do we, do you have any advice on how to enter the world? It often feels binary that we have one worldview and then we have a career path, and how do we find and make these opportunities to have and hold and honor that intersection? It doesn't always feel like they're always accessible, right?
I find that getting people outside rather than in a classroom and sharing a traditional story or a story that is very that resembles that. Like I shared that story about stand 1. So the elders, what they said to me was, "This stand is sacred. And they had a whole ceremony there. The stand is our teacher. And so I find that when I share stories across cultures, people respond to that very much. I've had, like in Canada, I had Earthwatch volunteers from all over the world joining us in the field, and I was very worried about how, and they were helping with data collection, working with the Kainai First Nation, and I had concerns about how would this work, you know, for them to be open and respectful in such a foreign, what to many of them it seemed like such a foreign way of looking at the world. I found that simple ceremonies such as doing a tobacco offering in the field, burning sweetgrass, can just shift the mood enough. But I also ground things always with really solid, best quality Western science. You know, and so for people who might be skeptical, especially students who are asking a million questions and taught, you know, as part of their critical thinking to question things, to make sure everything is grounded in the best possible Western science as well. But the stories I find are really, really rapidly get into, you know, help people get into a different space.
So Christina, this will be the end of our answers and questions timeframe. We really want to thank you very, very much for coming and lending your wisdom to all of us today. And I'm so honored to have you here and so thankful that you are here in our presence today. I'd also like to thank everyone here, Dr. Dean DeLuca, Starker family, Jerry Franklin, Norm Johnson, Michael Nelson, and all of you who are here and have participated and listened and witnessed the importance of what this knowledge is all about. We just really want to thank you, and we hope that you go about your day in a beautiful way.
Fire.